coming through the mic? Okay. So for me, the way you plugged into a conversation that the three of us, you, myself, and Jonathan have been having, and then Jonathan and I have been having it, and JP Marceau and I have been, and so I want to first of all lay out common ground, and then we can get into a dialogue. So first of all, some very clear common ground is that, and I mean, I've just published 3 papers on this, so I do strongly, and I think there's good scientific ethnography and work, and the papers I published, and they've been published in bona fide academic journals, so it's that, you know, there is a collective intelligence and distributed cognition, and that's a real thing, and it has a real problem-solving abilities, and in that sense, it is doing a kind of relevance realization. And so, for me, none of that is in dispute. This is odd for me. In some ways, I actually prefer the term spirit for that than consciousness, because the term, especially like the German term Geist, is so broad and doesn't demand that we attribute a lot of the things that we usually attribute to what I'll call personal consciousness. And so the issue for me about consciousness is the tricky one, and I was trying to get at it in my talk, and that the relationship between consciousness and intelligence is intimate, but it's not reductive or identical. So consciousness and intelligence aren't identical. You can't simply reduce consciousness to intelligence, because a lot of our intelligent behavior goes on without at least without personal consciousness, etc. But trying to separate consciousness from intelligence also doesn't make any sense. If my argument is a cogent argument, then recursive relevance realization is an enhancement of intelligence. This speaks to the widespread cross-cultural and cross-historical proposal that alterations of consciousness can actually make us more intelligent, wiser, better at zeroing in on what's relevant, better than attaching to the real. That's one of the advantages of the model I was proposing. So what I'm trying to say is, I find the relationship, these two things, and you know, I do this nice academic talk, and it's all nicely all put together, and you come in and goes, and no, that's what you're supposed to do. That's what you're supposed to do. And so what I meant is, you put your finger on 2 dimensions that I find very complex and challenging, and I'd like to talk to you about. One is the idea of these levels, I think indisputable levels, especially the levels above, of collective intelligence within distributed cognition, and that they have a kind of agency. And then the other issue about the tight but not identical or reducible relationship between consciousness and intelligence. Because I think those 2 questions are actually interwoven together, and they're both very tricky questions. And I would propose to you that it would be good if we tried to keep them from getting confounded or conflated together, and we sort of like, let's be really clear about the consciousness-intelligence relation, and then let's be really clear when we're talking about the levels, and try to parse them out. Because a concern I have, I'm not saying you did this, but a concern I have is we can sort of slide between those 2 and get confused. And so that's my first initial sort of primary response I had to your talk, and you wing things well. And you one final thing, right? I mean, there's a way in which your question could have been, you know, silly, and it wasn't, because, you know, all semantic terms are fuzzy, right? And so if you just, and I'm not saying you did this, but this is the other thing I would like to clear. There's a difference between, you know, like what's a cat, and, you know, Wittgenstein made it famous, what's a chair? Well, you can't get a clear definition and all that. And so you want to separate sort of semantic fuzziness from, are we unclear about the phenomena in question? And I took it that you were trying to do the second and not the first. So did that make sense? There are 3 things I'd like to keep sort of in play, but clearly distinct from each other.
Yeah. You know, even when you say enhanced consciousness, I mean, part of the difficulty that I see is almost every time we put an adjective, higher consciousness.
No, I said an enhanced intelligence.
Enhanced intelligence, okay.
Yeah, right.
But the struggle that I have with this word is often, and your lecture brought it out very well. I mean, what exactly are we talking about? And so maybe start with the levels of consciousness, because one of the tensions that I felt in your talk was it seems like the academic conversation is getting more and more sort of human-centric and perhaps even human-exclusive. And you mentioned it. You know, we would say, is a cat conscious? And then the question is, what do we mean by that word again? Mm-hmm. Because I think most of us would say a cat has consciousness. And so, and then the really profound thing that I noted in the Peterson Richard Dawkins thing, which I really connected up with, you know, I thought one of the biggest impacts of awakening from the meaning crisis I had was your connection with relevance realization and Darwinian selection. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that then, I don't know, that, and so I wonder, and in listening to your, you know, as we're getting more and more sort of high, talking about consciousness with respect to humans and all of these things, where does that, what about these other lower levels?
Sure.
And because creatures are every day involving themselves with their environment, and to the best of our knowledge, not having the experience we are having, and certainly not, you're talking about sort of the conscious of being conscious, and I thought, wow, that's really high, as you noted. So I was really curious about your thoughts on this relationship between relevance realization, consciousness, and sexual selection. I don't know what to do with other kinds of selection, and I thought that really linked into your awakening from the meaning crisis.
Okay, let me try. First comment, I think that Dawkins was doing a sloppy job in that. He's a scientist who thinks he's a philosopher, and he's wrong. When he said there's, you know, there's no essential difference between consciousness and intelligence, it's like, then he's immediately trapped in a bunch, and Jordan's smart enough to see, I've got you. Like that was a stupid move, Richard, and of course Jordan doesn't say that, but he's like, okay, give me that identity and I'll run this and I'll get God out of it and you'll be trapped, and that's what happened. But right, and so that's exactly. See, Dawkins failed to do exactly what I'm asking that we do. Is we don't simply separate them, and we don't simply identify them. We give up that kind of simplistic relationship, like either or. And again, I'm not accusing you of anything. And we're trying to get them. So for me, I was trying to say that relevance realization gives us intelligence, and intelligence is our capacity to solve problems, general problem solvers. But there's this class of problems, those that are high in novelty, complexity, and ill-definedness, that require recursive relevance realization that gives us perspectival knowing. And that is when we pass from intelligence to consciousness. And that is also different from self-consciousness, which is your consciousness of a self that possesses consciousness. And we only have evidence for there, I think we have very good tests. I teach a course on this. We have tests about whether or not certain animals have that kind of self-consciousness. And so, you know, I'm pretty confident that, you know, elephants and chimps and probably porpoises do, and maybe Caledonian crows. The test hasn't been done, but I bet they'll pass it. And we have really good evidence that lions and other animals that are otherwise quite intelligent don't have that. So intelligence is relevance realization. That's your capacity to be a general problem solver. Specific type of problems, high in novelty, high in complexity, high in ill-definedness, needs recursive relevance realization that gives you that perspectival knowing I was talking about. That's consciousness. And then there's an additional thing, which is a being that has a sense of self. It's self-consciousness. And so for me, that's how I would, and then you can ask, well, what's going on in self-consciousness above consciousness? And that's another question, and that's about the nature of the self. And I've done a lot of work on that, you know. I'm happy to talk about that, but what I'm just saying, I think there's a principled way of distinguishing intelligence from consciousness and consciousness from self-consciousness. And then given those principles, we can ask about these different levels. Like I said, I'm willing to, and I get flack for it, by the way, like with Jonathan's use of spirit for these things, and I think it's a good term, or angels or demons, and I get flack from, some of the people I'm talking about. I say, oh, you should be really praying. Oh, how dare you allow him? And I was like, what are you talking about? Like it's a discussion about whether or not this word applies. Well, that's not how people always use the word. Well, we used to think that motion was relative to the earth. And if you don't allow me to, that means that the earth can't possibly move, because motion means motion relative to the earth. So that's it. Copernicus is out. That's a stupid argument, right? We have to always be playing with the meaning of terms in order to try and match up to new realizations, right? I, in good faith, think that's what Jonathan is doing. That's how I defend him. So I'm willing, like I say, I don't have any problem with applying the word Geist, spirit. I use logos and other terms for that. But I do think there is a way, and you can disagree with me, and that'd be great. But what I mean is, I do think I have a principled answer to that question. How do I distinguish intelligence from consciousness from self-consciousness?
I struggle with sort of this at both ends. The higher self-consciousness, I think that's very easy for us to relate to. But even, again, as a pastor, this question, which just emerged, right now, so, points for Burke on winging it. I was a little nervous. I'm sitting here talking to these guys, and they're talking about your lecture, and I'm thinking, is Google...
Sorry, I didn't want to cause you that much suffering.
No, you didn't cause that. Wait to see what we do to Peugeot. But even this question, which I think bears on the topic, especially in this conversation with respect to artificial intelligence.
Yes.
Is Google reading my email?
No. The answer is no.
Okay, talk to me more about that.
Because if you're using the word unequivocally, we can use read as a
Right.
metaphor for lots of things, like
Right.
I read it in her face. That's not right. But if you mean reading text and getting semantic meaning from it, no, Google is not doing that. Google is tracing probabilistic relations between graphic representations, symbols, and that. Oh, and that the guy at my lambdas. Because when I'm talking to it. Good grief. Human beings have been talking to trees and other things. Parents talk on behalf of their non-linguistic children. How is Timmy today? You're really good, aren't you? We do that all the time. We are experts at talking on behalf of things and filling in the pieces. You know what the real test is? And when you do, you take one of those and you get another one and you have them talk to each other. And then within about a minute, they are batshit crazy. Because they're not reading or listening because they're not picking up on the semantic meaning at all.
So that picking up on the semantic meaning, how is that related to consciousness?
So and this was an interesting proposal of Descartes. This will take a little bit. Can I have like 5 minutes? Okay.
It's okay with me.
Is that okay with everyone else? Okay, so contrary to what people think, Descartes did not think that animals aren't intelligent, right? And because he's Descartes, he's brilliant, right? He knows that dogs can do really smart stuff. So he's like, oh, how do they do this? And he came up with this idea, well, that there are states in their brain that reliably covary with the world, right? So here's a thing in the world, and then I get a brain state, and they reliably covary, so the dog can predict when that's going to be there and knows when it's not there because this pops up and that's pretty brilliant. But we rag on Descartes, but man, I wish I made his mistakes. But so what's interesting is most people, when you ask them, is covariation enough for representation? They'll say no. Because the problem is my state is covarying with this, but is it covarying with the glass, Or is it covarying with this object that's an artifact? Is it covarying, like, this has many different aspects, and the covariation does not discriminate amongst aspects. Remember the aspectuality? And so what Descartes thought is dogs have intelligence because they can do the covariation, but they don't have consciousness, because what consciousness does is it aspectualizes the covariation so that I now can see this as a glass or a container or a tool, and I can then start to form concepts. So what happens is consciousness turns the covariation into a representation that is ready for reason. Now that's a really good answer, and we've ignored, and I use that, I should have credited him actually, that's a huge influence on the lecture I just gave, and so that's the difference, right? That thing can sort of track the covariations, but it can't do any of the aspectualization that makes conceptualization and therefore reasoning possible. That's why I say it's not reading. If all you did when you were looking at is you just sort of made, like, I don't know, just inarticulate noise for the letters, and that didn't translate into you doing any of that aspectualization or readiness for reason, you're not reading. And that's how we test if people can read. That's how we test literacy. So Google, by all of those kinds of tests, completely fails every test for literacy.
So here's another question for you.
Sure.
Is the government reading my email?
So that one's harder. And I already admitted earlier on that's harder. And so now it's interesting because we have to be careful. There's a disanalogy in that your consciousness is not dependent on beings that are themselves conscious. Your neurons, as far as we can tell, I mean, at least given standard understanding of, your individual neurons are not conscious, but they're also not intelligent, but they form something that is. Governments are different because they are dependent on entities that are also individually conscious and intelligent. And so therefore the analogy is strained at a very important point. So I got to give a complex answer to that because of the strain in the analogy, which is not only are individuals reading your mail, and that's not problematic, but there is a collective intelligence in the distributed cognition that is solving problems about your email that no individual can solve because it takes all these people doing all this stuff connected to all these equipment. And in that sense, that collective intelligence is picking up on stuff that no individual person is. Just like the crew navigates the ship and there's no one person that does it. And in that sense, they're reading your email. But that also doesn't mean, right, that it's something that could exist independently of the individual consciousnesses and intelligences.
So then what is the relationship between consciousness and the government? I mean, it's clearly dependent on the consciousnesses
Yes.
of individual human beings.
Yes.
But in some strange way, now you're right about the neurons, but we also ourselves seem to also be composites of, I don't know if we are. I mean, I'm just simply asking the question. We almost seem ourselves to be composites
Yes.
of consciousnesses.
At least, this is actually really cool because this is going to be this is in an episode of After Socrates. This is actually a really developed idea that I think has a lot of merit to it, the notion of the dialogical self. That the self is not sort of a homogeneous thing, substance, but the self is actually a bunch of I positions where, so it's sort of, there are centers from which you do the recursive relevance realization perspective taking, and you have various ones, and they can therefore have different interests in the world because there are different perspectives, and that shows up in psychological phenomena. So you very much not only need outer dialogos, you need inner dialogos, and the two have to work together. And then I think Socrates' daemonium is actually about that. But that's another thing. By the way, that was shameless advertising for my new series. But so the notion that we're a dialogical self and not a monological monadic self, I actually agree with that. And so the notion, but the thing that is very problematic in the literature, and I don't mean problematic in the sense that this is a contradiction. The thing that people are wrestling with is, yeah, but what is the nature of these I positions when they're not active? Here's why it's problematic. This goes back to James, the I and the me. The me is any aspect of myself of which I can be aware. It's me as object of awareness. The I is never the object of awareness, so it is never an object. It is a no thing in a deep sense. And so the no things don't follow our rules for things, and so talking about I positions as if they are selves is problematic because they only seem to be the I pole until the dialogue is actually in existence. Did that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I think it makes sense.
Okay, and so, and then you know, and you have, now I'm trepidatious because we're in the arena of giants, right? Because, you know, is the no thing a self or a not self? And the answer seems to be, yeah. That's right? And so trying to answer that question for me is, I don't think, what I can say is it's not right to think of them as constantly existing homunculi that are just waiting to take the center stage of consciousness. It's more like potential pieces of music that can be played, but until they're played, there's no song. I'm trying to get sort of an analogy, right?
Yet they also, in terms of the self that gets expressed, I would think that we feel the interplay of them.
Yes.
As we live, and as we choose, and as we act.
But that I that's feeling the interplay of the other I's is just another I position, and it can then be the object of another I position that feels the conflict between that I position and another I position. The problem we have is we try to think, well, there's one that is the one, and the problem seems to be that that doesn't sort of stand up under deeper analysis. It doesn't mean, by the way, that you're a fragmented, disconnected stuff. It means that the through line going through all the I things is not a typical kind of physical unity. I'm sorry, this is really hard stuff.
Well, and it seems to me that when we're together, we're actually watching, someone that you know very well, intimately, or someone with whom you have a long-term work relationship with. You begin to know those little, and you watch and track, and then it's back and forth, because part of the thing is that we're such subtle humans that when certain things are manifesting in you, then I am now taking the other side.
Totally, and your inner. What did you call it? Your council?
My consciousness Congress.
Like it's constantly reconfiguring.
Yeah.
And then, so the weird thing seems to be that there's this sort of imaginal space, and then the I positions sort of take the seat of consciousness, and then and then they shift around. So, if you take me out of this context, I would become indistinguishable from the potted plant because my personality changes rather significantly. Yeah.
That could be a superpower.
Well, no, I don't become physically like a plant. What I mean is I'll just be very quiet, and I'll want to be in the corner and not have people talk to me. And people are often shocked when that happens. I'm often shocked. I stopped trying to make sense of that a long time ago. So what I'm saying is that I think there is something like an ability to generate consciousness. And then the self's relationship to it is dialogical, and there's different times when different I positions are in the seat of consciousness, and then different me's are in the spotlight of consciousness. And that's closer to our phenomenology than a much more standard model.
I'm also curious about this question of recognizing consciousness? Because
Yeah.
that seems also tremendously difficult.
Because we're in Meno's paradox, right? So Meno's paradox is if you know it, you don't go looking for it. And if you don't know it, how will you recognize it when you see it? And the problem for us, and that's why I didn't give a definition, and I was trying to say, let's take 5 things that everybody seems to agree point to consciousness, and what I'm going to be talking about is where they intersect. And so for me, that means a methodological principle. Any proposal for consciousness that doesn't draw all of those lines into convergence should be questioned, So I think your question is deep and important, and the problem is and it's, because consciousness is simultaneously so familiar and so mysterious to us. And so it really makes Meno's paradox very, 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 very hard for us to realize, because we confuse our familiarity with knowing what consciousness is.
And I think that's especially true, I think to a certain degree, evident. And, one of the things, I want to say this, that is profoundly moving to me about this, what we're doing in this room, and so special is that, this isn't sort of a one-off that John and I, and all of you know this because we've, I counted out, I think we've had 18 conversations together, which isn't a lot, but
But they're really good ones.
Yes, really good ones. And so, there's a degree of trust here, and I think we both have that, where we can ask hard questions to each other, and we can challenge each other, and maybe we'll have a wrestling match with Peugeot over what he's done to all of John's critics, but. And so then, part of what, when I listened to your thing, part of what I recognized was, again, the difficulty of wrestling with consciousness we're quite naturally so focused on human-sized consciousness.
But it's because we have special access to human consciousness.
Right.
And so because we have that special access, I think rightly should have a kind of epistemic authority. Now, the point you're making is the fact that it has that epistemic, even epistemological priority, isn't the same thing as giving it an ontological priority. I think that is very well said. I agree with that point. I think that's a very good point. And whether or not you were satisfied with it, I was trying to pull those two apart in my talk. I was trying to say, let's do this epistemic thing before we talk about what consciousness is. Really get clear about how we're doing the questioning, and then we'll go in and look at theories of consciousness. I actually tried to separate those two issues apart because I think you're bang on. Like that the fact, like we can easily confuse the epistemic authority it has because we have so much access with its ontological priority. Yes, but I did try to respond to that in the talk by actually breaking the two apart from each other.
Yeah, and it's not a criticism. Part of what makes these conversations both so productive is that in many ways, it was just you gave such a scientific talk, and that's not a criticism because you're a scientist and that's exactly what you do. And then I thought, now I'm going to get up there and I'm a pastor.
But you asked really good questions.
Yeah, well,
No. Like I've already acknowledged, like you just made another one, and the one about the levels, and the one about the relationship between intelligence and consciousness. Those are all the right questions to ask. And then the meta point you made, that those questions that you're asking are not just knowledge questions, they're existential questions. They're the kinds of questions that sort of bite into the depths of people's lives. I think that's right too. And so one of the things I would like, the problem, so I asked for some indulgence here because many of you know I'm not just doing that scientific project around consciousness and relevance realization. I'm trying to build a bridge to spirituality, to meaning making, meaning cultivation, and wisdom cultivation. And so I think the point that any answer about the nature and function of consciousness should also deeply connect to, for lack of a phrase, responding to the meaning crisis. I think that's right too, because ultimately, I alluded to that at the beginning of the talk. Like, your consciousness is extremely valuable to you, but why? right? And that's an existential question. That's not a functional in nature. Why do you care so much about it? And people do. And wouldn't it be good if we could make intelligible to people why they value their consciousness so much, so that they could have a more reflective appreciation in both the sense of gratitude and understanding for their consciousness? Isn't part of the problem we have with drugs and other altered states of consciousness is we simultaneously value it but don't understand why we do, and that's why we take substances that alter our consciousness in this way? So if we had a proper understanding of consciousness that afforded a real appreciation for it, I think that would go a long way to alleviating a lot of the trouble people get into, precisely at that nexus point where the understanding of consciousness and the value of consciousness meet. Did that track?
Yeah. And I guess and I'm by no means, criticizing you in this at all, because
You can criticize me if you want.
well, I know. But as a pastor, so many of the issues, obviously pastorally, deal with a lot of consciousness between human beings all the time. I mean, that's the bulk of pastoral work. But the questions about God and the historical practices of the church and the tradition of the church. You have when you have, let's say, St. Francis, talking about brother sun and sister moon.
Sure.
And on one hand,
And the Bible does that too.
the Bible does it all the time.
Yeah.
And then the question of, and this maybe is further afield of where we wanted to go, but it gets into the area that we've talked about quite a bit in terms of a scientific domain, because science has such a heavy thumb on the scales of so many people's lives that so here's consciousness, and I think a deep part of the meaning crisis has been this question of, well, how do I relate to this world? And so much of that relating is sort of a mirror looking back, because if I can deconstruct my consciousness, and in some ways that consciousness is sort of a really sacred space, and it's the sacred space in you and me, and the relating to one another as conscious beings, and the respect for that. I mean, even all of the animal rights issues. California, for example, passed a law based on basically the imagined consciousness experience of chickens, that as if the populace of California had much of any understanding of the life of a chicken, when most of us are. So this for me is, and again, it's not a critique, but that's part of the reason pastorally why I say, wow, this is an important conversation.
It is, and I think, I don't eat mammals, but I eat chickens because I do have certain conclusions about these things. But I don't propose that I have any definitive answer on that. You have to make an ethical choice because you can't not eat, right? And so, but I think what they did as a law for an entire state is ridiculously morally pretentious. I mean, like that would be a conclusion after 100 years of really, really good discussion, I think, about being, while we know what the imagined consciousness of a chicken is, I don't know. I mean, Uxall does there's some really good work on that. He tells you what's the world look like if you were a fly, and what would the world look like if you're a bird, and it's a really good book. I recommend it. But he also put a lot of care and did a lot of phenomenology in it. I guess I'm wondering, because I'm sort of trying to get something that's coming. It's like this issue I think the issue, maybe, let me try and see if this lands. There's an additional issue that I didn't talk about. And you're putting your finger on it, and I think it's good. Let me see if this lands. If it doesn't, or maybe even if it doesn't land, it's close enough and it's relevant. There's the issue about the function, the nature of consciousness, and then there's a philosophical problem about the attribution of consciousness. And I hear you talking about that a lot. Is that fair?
Yes, yes.
Okay, because see, for me, now, I don't think now, when the attribution swings free of any attempt to give a deep and integrated answer to the nature and function question, I find it pretentious. That was my criticism of the law, right? But I do think your point, which you've agreed to, that this is a different question from the nature and function question. Now, would you agree, though, it's not independent?
Yes,
The attribution,
yes.
Okay. So,
And it's theologically significant, as I noted in terms of the Hebrews take a stand on this in a way that's really nuanced and interesting.
well, and we've had, the three of us have had, and you were very kind to me in your slide about non-theism and classical theism as distinct from current theism. So first of all, thank you for that. That was kind. And I suppose the theological issue is the question about whether or not God is conscious.
And also, it's
Wait, do you think he is, or she is, or whatever? I don't want to gender God. Is God conscious?
Yes, I believe so.
Right.
And I believe that the assumption, that attribution of consciousness, then motivates people into all of these classical Christian practices. And for example, one of the things that came up in, this is now, we did the German festival, and I've just done a whole bunch of these things in the last month, which has been wonderful, because the thing is, it's wonderful to hear what things bubble up. And so, for example, with this Dutch academic that I did the New World podcast in, one of his big questions is, okay, meditation and prayer.
Yeah.
And so much of that movement has to do with this question of attribution of consciousness to, things that are, or even it's such an intuitive way for us to relate. And so, so when Rupert Sheldrake asked, is the sun conscious? It was like, wow. Biblically, theologically, I've been formed in a certain way. Is that important? And when Eric Weinstein, who wrestles with these questions and says, the really scary thing about God is we don't know what's on his mind. There's a question of attribution of consciousness with respect to the arena that we are engaging in. So it's a lot of those kinds of questions that pastorally, where it intersects with questions of consciousness, that question of attribution of consciousness,
right,
is really key for, and I think for many who are working their way through the meaning crisis.
Sure. So, and this is an open question, I'm not trying to trap you or anything. You've already acknowledged there's difficulties in attributing consciousness to other things. Are there difficulties, therefore, aren't there huge difficulties in attributing consciousness to God that would be sort of magnifications of we're ignorant of the inner life of a cat, presumably we're ignorant of ultimate reality. Doesn't the attribution problem get magnified with God?
Yes.
Okay.
but where this, part of where this goes with the meaning crisis is you get into some things where, and when I look at people who are, some of the earlier slides that I talked about in terms of nihilism, people begin to have questions about the attribution of consciousness to themselves.
Totally. And I think that's the issue. And so, right. So I'm not giving in to a generalized hermeneutics of suspicion when I ask that question. I'm trying to say, given I'm not a nihilist, and given that I think there is intelligibility, and the question, therefore, has a potential answer. That's the perspective from which I was asking that question. I think that's right. I'm sort of savoring something. You're proposing that there's a normative. It sounds to me like you're proposing, there's a normativity for the attribution of consciousness, and the attributions are not single events, but they form a very complex implicit network, and that network has been significantly undermined by the meaning crisis. Is that a fair interpretation of what you're saying?
Yes.
First of all, that's wickedly cool. That's very good. I hadn't thought. The fact that I didn't think of it is not why it's. Sorry, I did. No, that's really good. That's really good. That's okay. I think I want to think about it, but I'll say in good faith that strikes me as at least prima facie a very plausible proposal, and I think a very good proposal. And so that would mean the degree to which the undermining of the attribution of consciousness outside of God is also contributing to the difficulties, right? But also, perhaps vice versa, the degree to which God has drifted away from, that has fed back into undermining the normative network for the attribution of consciousness. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay, I think I agree with that, too. I think that's that's very good. That's very good, Paul. So, I accept that, at least in good faith and prima facie. So I'm asking this question from that then. I'm not Richard Dawkins. When you answered my two questions very succinctly. When I asked you, is God conscious? You said yes. And then when I said, is the attribution problem much harder? You said a single answer, yes, to both of those. Can you, and again, I'm like, how do they go together for you? And again, I'm not here to
I know, John.
Yeah,
I know, John.
Okay, good.
I trust easily, and you have shown yourself to be enormously trustworthy, and I've seen that in how many different times and places, and which is why, again, I value my relationship with you and these opportunities, because I think in some ways, in a weird way, dare I say, that consciousness of trust is sort of contagious, and I see that, when we model it, people pick it up.
I think the manner of what we're doing is in the end more important than the matter.
No, I agree. I was asked by a woman, question I get all the time, do you believe in miracles? Or more specifically with respect to answered prayer. And I told her, I said, based on things I've seen in my life, my position with respect to Scripture, all of these things, miracles, as we call them colloquially, are not a big problem for me. The difficulties come in. I said it's far more difficult when, and Lou Smedes, a Christian Reformed scholar, pointed this out. It's far more difficult when miracles actually happen to some who we believe are unworthy, and don't happen to those we believe are more deserving.
Right, there's a moral rejection that's very different from the epistemic rejection. Right. I get that. And
so I think for what I've seen in terms of people as they, let's say, deconstruct, I talked about Verizon Lisa. Verizon Lisa, if she was someone who deconstructed, probably walked away from the idea that she could have a conscious relationship with a personal, interrelating God, and often the case is because, the undeserving got good things, and the more deserving got bad things, and so I can't believe in such a God. Verizon Lisa turns around and, interestingly enough, begins to try to relate to universe,
yes,
impersonalized, non-conscious, systemic, and very quickly starts to personalize it. Now we can easily dismiss Verizon Lisa as, well, she's not thinking it through, and she's not terribly self-conscious about what she's doing. I, as a pastor, watch her, because as a pastor, she may or may not be within my realm of influence. And it has a lot to do with, okay, so should we step in and correct her in terms of her implicit attribution of consciousness to the universe. And if the question of is the Son conscious is a fun one, and it's difficult, and it has everything to do with attribution.
Yes.
Well, how much more so the totality of everything with which we are engaging?
So I feel that, and this is good, I think, that you're alluding to your finesse argument, because you presented it here. And so the spirit of finesse argument. And so, I mean, the two of you, I mean this affectionately, you both wound me, and then I go away, and I really think deeply.
The two of you, me and
Jonathan.
Oh, okay.
Right,
So worried about the two consciousnesses inside.
No. Right, and I think about, and then what I mean is, I try to, sorry, why did I say wound? I had a really excellent conversation with a chaplain, and I put it on, I can't remember his name, on my channel, and he talked about forgiveness is actually bearing the wound and coming to appreciate it because you accept the new life that is made available to you through the wound. And he then gave Christ as the example of forgiveness. And so that's I get, and then what happens is I grow into a different, I think I do, I grow into a different, like at least a different theorist or a different person in response. Like Jonathan said, John does all these individual practices, and then that's turned into the whole Dialectic into Dialogos project. And I have him to thank for that. If he didn't make that criticism, none of that would have happened. And then a lot of what I consider my most valuable and important of work, both theoretically and existentially, would not have occurred. So thank you, Jonathan. That's important. But I've been thinking a lot about the spirit of finesse, and this is how I bore that wound. If I can now use that, and I'm not trying to use it sacrilegiously. You get that, right? Okay, good. Because I don't want to do that. So I don't know if any of you, if any of you seen it, or either one of you used it. I gave a talk at Cambridge, and I'm doing a lot about the imaginal and ritual and how it's inherently bound up with rationality. And so the imaginal, again, I'll need a couple minutes. Okay. The imaginal is distinct from the imaginary. The imaginary is when we use imagery to take us away from perception, and we're largely escaping from reality. This is I'm sort of integrating Corbin and Tolkien here. And the imaginal is when we use the imagination to enhance perception and help us to recover the depths of reality. There's a difference. So the imaginary is I can ask you, picture a sailboat in your mind, are its sails up? And you can say yes or no. Now here's the imaginal. I'm getting people to do Tai Chi, learn how to re-inhabit their bodies, recover their bodies. And I'm saying, when you're standing in Tai Chi, I say, stand as if your knees to your feet are in the mud of a river. They're sinking in. You're not skimming the surface. You're sinking in. From here to here is like flowing water. You want this to feel like flowing water. The way water has flexibility but force. And from here to here is like the air. You want it to feel as airy, as dissipated as possible. And people aren't forming mental pictures. They might, but they don't need to. What they're doing is they're reorienting their salience landscaping and their perspectival knowing so that they can start to perceive otherwise very subtle patterns in their body and interactions between body and mind, so they can start to do Tai Chi properly. Does that work for what the imaginal is?
Yes.
Okay, and then the imaginal is not just vertical, it extends through time. So if you go into a university and you get the academics who are supposed to be the best, so that was some self-deprecating humor, and you give them really clear evidence and clear arguments that they should start saving for their retirement immediately, and they, yes, and that you give them chances to raise any objections they might have. Oh, no. And you come back in 6 months, and by the way, this is all empirically validated, experimental, right? You come back in 6 months and none of them are saving. It has to do with hyperbolic discounting. Now you do this. You say, I want you to imagine your future self as a family member that you love and you care about and you want to take care of. And I want you to really You see how you're using the imagination to actually realize a real relationship to your future self? And you come back 6 months, what you find is the people that do that start to save, and the more vividly they engage in the practice, the more they save. So the ability to pursue long-term goals and the aspiration to become more rational is itself a long-term goal, depends on the imaginal. Is that right? And so for me, part of the argument I'm making is that the imaginal, and when it's involved in that kind of serious play like in Tai Chi, is implicit ritual. So although we've lost explicit ritual, implicit ritual is everywhere, and but we need to bring it back, and when we properly reappreciate it, we see its deep interconnection with the broader notion of rationality. And thank you for mentioning that my notion is not Sam Harris's notion, right? Okay, so I'm saying all of that because this is my way of trying to articulate the spirit of finesse. Okay?
I like it.
Thank you. Now, and so I hope you still, I hope you still want to keep talking though, because the point is, right, I'm not in a river when I'm doing the imaginal for enhancing the Tai Chi, but it allows me to actually perceive. It's a lens, if I can use that metaphor, that allows me to perceive things, real patterns that I otherwise couldn't see. And it seems to me that the finesse argument would be like that. Taking the personal lens allows me to see things about reality that I wouldn't otherwise see. But that isn't a grounds for attributing personhood to what I see.
Right. But it's also easy to know you're not in a river.
Right.
And it's very difficult to know the nature of this. This, to me, we keep getting back to this question. What in fact is the relational aspect of the nature of our existence?
Yes.
I'm going to jump in right there.
She's got the answer, and we're all done.
It's 42, I think. We're just going to take a minute. I'll bring up a chair, get another microphone, and we'll bring everyone else into that. We're right on the cusp. I think we should let those thoughts continue to formulate.
Okay.
So just stay where you are, and
Yeah, that was very good.
so I'm going to go through some of the comments. There's so many. There's a lot of interaction and reactions, what you both were saying. So we won't be able to cover all of them, but fortunately we still have 2 more days ahead of us. So you responded to the question, is God conscious, but is God self-conscious?
If, as someone within my tradition would say, very much so. When the Lord and Abraham are having the conversation they're having in Genesis 18, Abraham is asking, will the God of heaven and earth do evil to Sodom and Gomorrah? And that then, it's a dramatic passage because, this little Abraham, who's not been particularly faithful in terms of everything that's been given him, now, in a sense, takes the God of heaven and earth and puts him back on his heels in a way to consider. And same thing happens in the book of Jonah when, Jonah goes and, 40 days and you're going to be overturned, and I can't wait. And Nineveh puts on sackcloth and ashes. And I remember learning to read Hebrew, and one way of translating, and God repented of the evil he was about to do to Nineveh. I thought, in a Calvinist school, I thought, we've got to think about that some more. So yes, I think God, as he is represented in the Bible, is quite self-conscious. And many passages, for example, in the book of Hosea, where God is debating, Ephraim, on one hand, I must judge you. On the other, you're my son. How can I judge you? And so the God of the Bible is full of self-consciousness and inner dialogue.
So how do you both personally curate your consciousness? It's a shift in tone.
Should I go first? Every morning, I practice meditation, contemplation, Tai Chi Chuan, Lectio Divina, inner dialogue, and as a way of trying to, I guess I'll use the word, to curate my consciousness, precisely because I do think it has the function of being this recursive relevance realization that affords perspectival knowing, and making that work better means, right, developing virtues of attention and awareness and alertness, etc. All of that. Changing the access relationship between my conscious and unconscious mind. I think that it takes, Socrates would say things like, you spend all this time on your hair and you've spent so little time on your psyche. And I'm trying to reverse that. I want to spend a lot more time on my consciousness and my psyche than on my hair. And that's why my hair isn't that great. And so I think I would ask people to consider that very, very deeply. Given how valuable your consciousness is to you, how are you caring for it? How are you, in a disciplined manner, trying to increase its virtuosity and, dare I say it, its virtue? And if you don't have a good answer to that question, I think, right? And I'm sorry, the question that people often give is, I don't have enough time. Take half of the time you spend on your cell phone and you have enough time. That's it. You don't even have to give it all up, half of it, and you have enough time. Because all you're doing on your cell phone is just miscurating your attention, your sensitivity, your self-awareness, etc. And so I'm not doing this as a grandfather shaking my finger at you. I'm trying to give you, I think, advice from Socrates about maybe really considering that if your consciousness is so deeply valuable, that you care for it appropriately.
Well, now I wonder about what we mean by consciousness. Because, and the word curate is interesting because I think about
Good word.
Yeah, in terms of a museum, because a museum not only sort of preserves and attends, it also displays. And this for me is, perhaps part of my quick answer to, is God conscious? Yes, because as a Christian, one of the things that happens in the Christian life is that at some point you believe you live before an audience of one. And that, again, gets into this attribution of consciousness, that God is watching. And finally, that God is my judge. And people, of course, will have their own opinions. And so it's very deeply connected into the Christian life, that I curate my consciousness, I curate myself for my God, who obviously has some expectations on how I treat not only my God, but my neighbor as myself. And I think another way that I actually, at the German festival, we got talking about journaling, and part of what I realized is that I journal to all of you who watch my videos.
Yeah, that's right, you do.
And so I attribute consciousness to you, and you have very much reinforced that idea. And it holds me. I curate it for my church, but also for you. And the part of the irony of this strange thing that I've started doing 5 years ago is many of you see me more hours a week than many of the members of my church. Now, they know me in a different way because they know me physically in a 360-degree way, but that's, in some ways, I curate my consciousness through you. And so I'm deeply, thank you for your time and attention. I don't think I could say it any better than John always says it, because that's what you give me.
So what do you consider to be the primary ethical implication of your view of consciousness?
Who is that directed to? I went first last time.
Well, I don't know. My issue with the California law about chickens is I just don't think that the average voter in California has any idea about chickens. Most of us eat them, but few of us live with them. And I'm not saying it's a bad law or a good law. It's just every time I see something about chickens, it's like, how much do I really know about that? Yet, this position of broad attribution, which I think I hold with respect to consciousness, also, I believe, postures me towards a position of respect. When we're having an estuary meeting, I think we need to respect what the group is creating together. And even though I'm doubtful that most California voters know much about chicken consciousness, I believe chickens do have consciousness, and that consciousness ought to be respected. And so consciousness seems to be in our ethical world. I think one thing that has happened in our ethical world is that everything has sort of been flattened into, does X cause suffering? That seems to be the only thing that people care about. That then impinges very quickly on the question of consciousness, because what is the relationship between consciousness and suffering? And if the avoidance of suffering is kind of our cultural main ethical agenda, well, the question of attribution of consciousness suddenly looms large. So, does that answer the question?
Yes.
Okay.
So the primary ethical implications of my view of consciousness was that? Well, I already gave you one. Take care of your consciousness the way you take care of things you claim to really value. I think that's an important, there's a Socratic aspirational ethos that comes out of that. And that's especially pertinent to my position on consciousness because of the deep connections I see between consciousness and the ability to enhance ratio religio, being in rightly proportioned relationship and connectedness to things. So if you think meaning as religio needs to be ratio, to be properly proportioned, like we have to properly proportion our attention, properly proportion our arousal, et cetera, that's what I mean, then there's a really important, and you think that's core, then of course we have an obligation to consciousness insofar as consciousness also bears on ratio religio. So that, what I already said, I think that's one primary ethical implication, like become a connoisseur of your consciousness because of that Socratic argument, and then in relation to Paul's argument, how are we going to get better at the attribution if we remain, what's the opposite of a connoisseur? An ignoramus? Is that the right opposite?
A glutton.
Or a glutton, perhaps, yeah.
Connoisseur, a glutton just shovels.
But I'm trying to get somebody who lacks the knowledge. That's why I was using the ignoramus. Yes. If I agree with you that we shouldn't just take the human-centric view, but it is, we agreed, an especially important one, and so I think we have to become connoisseurs of consciousness if we're going to get better at finessing the attribution issue, which, as you've rightly argued, is also at the core of many of our ethical projects. And we're going to have to get better at it sooner than we imagine, because AGI is still coming. It's still coming, and right now it's easy to dismiss people who attribute consciousness to their machines. But 15 years from now, it's not going to be so easy. And if we are ignoramuses about consciousness, we will not have the wherewithal to exercise proper discernment as we face that challenge, which is going to challenge us the way nothing else. Forget the Industrial Revolution, forget the Agrarian Revolution. This is going to challenge us in ways we, unless civilization ends, right? So I think we also have an obligation to the future and even to the next generation to care more in the way I'm talking about, become connoisseurs of consciousness and virtue and wisdom, and they're all interwoven. Because if we don't, we are going to not prepare ourselves and our kids for one of the greatest moral challenges humanity has ever faced. I seriously think this is coming, and to pretend it's not coming and hope it doesn't come, it's a Cinderella. We've got to instead face up to the real possibility, and I think that also brings with it a very important moral obligation.
So John, why do you think consciousness cannot exist in systems that have slow connections? Why is speed a factor when it is not for, say, a Turing machine?
Right. That's an excellent question, because, and I don't withdraw from the point I made, I believe it was with you, Jonathan, when I said there's no reason in principle in which collective intelligence and distributed cognition couldn't have consciousness. But I didn't just say just speed. I said speed, complexity, density, degree of recursion. There's a lot of factors. Because we have, right, so we can, again, there's a sense in which I'm presupposing an answer here, so I'm sort of, but let's take it that we are sort of clear or we feel confident in our attributions to certain organisms, and then we can look for, like, what are the patterns of connectivity, speed, bandwidth, etc., that seem to be present in the organisms to which we attribute consciousness, and seem to be absent in the organisms that we don't attribute consciousness, and then see is the collective intelligence of distributed cognition, what kind of connectivity, density, etc. does it have? And is it more similar to the creatures that don't have consciousness, or the ones that do? And right now, most people think, and people who have sort of expertise in doing this beyond mine, say, no, these things don't have those. That's why I think of it. There's nothing a priori about speed, right? But it's that it seems to matter, and think about it, even intuitively, if I slowed down, so your beat of consciousness is faster than less intelligent animals. So a lizard can go a long time and there's no change for the lizard, whereas for you it's microseconds often. And there seems to be, therefore, a correlation, I'm just giving one example, between speed and consciousness and intelligence. And so that's why I give that argument. And that means, because it's not an argument in principle, but just an argument in terms of causal practicality, right? If we ever had neuronal links and we could really speed up the density, it might be that we put on all these chips and there's an actual group consciousness emerges, which is, again, that's coming, and what are we doing to prepare for that? By the way, the thing that Elon Musk made doesn't work, so that's good. We got more time. Because the science, there's good reason for that. The science that it was based on has now gone through a replication crisis and not been replicated. So the science that it was based on, so he can do all of his posturing. The science that the technology was based on has been undermined. So we've got another 10 years to prepare. because somebody will succeed. So, did that answer the question?
A comment was made, adverbial qualia might explain the Trinity. Thoughts?
What? How?
It's that Aquinas guy, the one with the funny collar.
So, wait. So the here-ness and the now-ness and the togetherness map onto the three persons of the Trinity in some way or something like that? I don't know what to do with that.
I didn't either.
I mean, there's higher level similarities. You've got three in oneness, and these are sort of like, especially if you take them to their absolutes of eternity, presence, and oneness. Those have been traditional attributes of God, and I don't know. It's interesting.
You have to work with Aquinas' model of the Trinity, and if you don't know that, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, I'm reading Clark right now, who's one of the stronger, his book One in the Many, and also his essays on metaphysics. And I've also read, and I met Sebastian Morello. And by the way, and I don't know if we'll get into a debate. I think a lot of the current arguments that Thomas is much more of a Neoplatonist than an Aristotelian are bang on. And that's what was in my mind when I was trying to do that. But I didn't do a good enough job. But maybe you and I could talk. That's really cool.
I'm not ready to talk in front of a microphone yet.
No, I didn't mean talk right here now. I didn't want to call you out. I meant maybe we can talk one-on-one. But did you agree with that, the initial proposal that Aquinas should be?
It has to do with the relations between the persons.
Yeah, no. I get that. But what I meant is that Aquinas is much more to be seen as a Neoplatonist than as an Aristotelian.
Yes, he loves Augustine first and Aristotle second.
Well, and Dionysius is actually cited more than Aristotle, apparently. And so I think this is such a cool revolution going on in Thomistic studies right now, because it actually could bring a bit of a rapprochement with Eastern Orthodoxy in some really powerful ways. Well, I mean, if Aquinas is a Neoplatonist, right, then he's closer to Maximus than if we think of him as an Aristotelian. That's a fair thing to say, don't you think?
I think a lot of the theologians, more and more, they're saying that there's a difference between Aquinas and later Thomism, and people always...
Yes, I totally agree with that. The pure nature philosophers that came up, that claim to be the followers of Aquinas, I made a mistake in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, right? And I attributed to Aquinas things that I should have attributed to his followers. Now, in my defense, that's how I was educated about Aquinas, that he was an Aristotelian, and there was no deep distinction between him and his followers, and that was wrong. So that episode is in error, right? And there'll be a note to that effect in the book. I could do a lot about what was wrong with Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, but yeah, I think this is exciting. And I'm not a Christian, but I think that possible rapprochement at a deep level, that's really, really cool.
Is asking what is consciousness the same as asking who am I? If not, what is the relationship between the self and consciousness?
It's not the same question, because I can ask I can ask what consciousness is without asking who am I, and that's the attribution question. I can ask, does a cat have consciousness? And that's, right? And so there's a question about what is the nature of something, which is different from the existential question of who am I? Like, answering the nature question is a necessary but radically insufficient way of answering the question, who am I? Yes, I am a human being, I'm a male, etc. But and this was a point made by Aquinas, right? That doesn't capture, those are all generic terms, so it doesn't capture who I am as an I. They can't capture who I am. So answering the nature of consciousness is not the same thing as asking the question, who am I would argue. The self and self-consciousness are bound up in a very important way, but you have a self even when you're not conscious. That's why it's wrong to murder you when you're unconscious. Oh, well, he's not conscious. There we go. No crime there, because no, you're still a self even when you're not conscious. And so the relationship between selfhood and consciousness is, and there are times when you lose self-consciousness, even though you're not losing consciousness, the flow state or the pure consciousness event. So I do think they're different things, but they come into relationship in self-consciousness. I do not think your self-consciousness, I'm doing after Socrates, so these questions are really pressing on me. I do not think your self-consciousness is the sole place you should look to answer the question, who am I? I think that's a mistake we've inherited from Descartes, and our culture is tunneling down onto this and hoping that the bottom is not falling out, even though the evidence is overwhelming that the bottom is falling out. You can't, I'm not saying ignore the question. I'm not saying ignore your self-consciousness when you're asking the question, but if you think that is the only place you need to look, I think the evidence is just mounting that you're wrong, and your culture is misleading you on that. You have to do, I think, and this is a Socratic proposal, that the best way to ask the question, who am I, is to ask him in a dialogue. And then he asks me, and we dialogue, because that's the best way we get at who am I, or at least as good as self-consciousness answers that question.
Let me ask you, Paul, what do you think is the connection between the self and consciousness?
I like what John just said. and especially the last point. Before I started any of this, I'm always thinking about writing a book. I'm probably way too ADHD to ever write any book. But the self is, again, and so this comes down to, in a sense, the curating of consciousness. And I'd much rather pivot that over towards the self, because there's a degree in which I don't know if I so much curate my consciousness as I steward my consciousness.
What's the difference? I agree there's a difference there. Can you explicate it?
Well, I think it's because of my association of curate with, let's say, a museum, where it is a stewarding, but it's also a presentation. And whereas my consciousness is, my self is far larger than my consciousness. And, I don't know that I would say the consciousness of Aquinas endures, but a lot of Aquinas obviously continues to endure.
Good thing.
Well, the consciousness of Aquinas doesn't endure on earth. I'll be a little careful with that. So, what was the question again? Oh, the I, the self, and the... and so I think the self is far broader, and what you said in terms of, if I want to know myself, I mean, having a dialogue with you, I'll learn a ton about myself, and that's part of what I do with my videos, and part of why I read the comments section, because you all teach me about me. And I'm not sure how much of my consciousness I'm learning from you, but I'm learning a whole lot about myself.
Yeah. I think the self is inherently dialogical, and therefore dialogos is the proper place both for self-knowledge in the Socratic sense and the aspiration to become the self that is also... See, the self is always something that's trying to transcend itself, and in an aspirational sense. And again, that needs dialogue. That needs dialogue.
So John, if we can have content-free consciousness that doesn't seem to square with consciousness being recursive relevance realization, because in content-free consciousness there is no relevance by definition. How do you square that?
I square it this way, and I had this insight. So great question, juicy question, it's dripping. So I was at the monastic, I was at Maple, the monastic academy, and I was there with the other leaders of the emerging communities, and we're trying to form a community of communities. And that's going very well, by the way. But I was asked, this is one of the, in my Thunderbolt summer, there was just so many things that were like, okay, I'll just go with that. I found myself explaining relevance realization to Buddhist monks. First surprise, they really liked it. Yeah. Second, I was asked a really good question by one of the monks. She said, well, we're taught that there's a state that's not framing. And like if you're saying we always have to frame because of combinatorial explosion, like how does it, and I could tell she found my argument persuasive, but she was invested in this tradition and they were going like, and then I sorry, don't read too much into it, but this was the phenomenology. I found myself saying something to her, and part of me is listening and going, hey, that's good, right? and so I'm carrying that around. I'll get to it. And then I'm in genuine dialogos between Zach Stein. Pay attention to what Zach Stein's doing. His stuff about intergenerational education, really important. And Steve March, Aletheia Coaching, also really highly recommend. And I was actually trying to sort of integrate their two positions, and then I brought this up. So this was worked out completely dialogically. And it occurred to me that there are states, well, this is a proposal, in which relevance realization is inherently interested in relevance realization because it's always in the process of evolving and self-correcting, right? But there can be a place where relevance realization can realize that relevance realization is irrelevant. Where would that be? Precisely when relevance realization, right, it needs to shut off because we are actually taking a stance not towards beings, but the ground of being itself. Because the ground of being is not anything to which relevance realization can be applied. And so, and this is the Buddhist thing. You do not get enlightenment by seeking it, but nobody comes to enlightenment except by seeking. And that was always like, what? And it's like, no. Relevance realization recursively realizes its own irrelevance in the face of opening up to being as such. Because there is no combinatorial explosion there, because there is no myriad of things. There is being, which is no kind of, there's being, big B, that is no set of beings. Being is not the totality of beings. It is that which makes each being possible. And so relevance realization that is for getting an optimal grip on beings has to realize it's irrelevant when we are trying to enter into relationship to the ground of being itself. And that's what these mystical experiences disclose to us. That's my answer.
That's a good answer. And with that, we can continue the conversation all together without me mediating it. If we could have people help who had signed up to volunteer to shut these chairs down and move them against that wall, we will have the musicians come up and the food will be up soon. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.